Okay, I think we can go now. And I would like to welcome everyone to the Global Education Futures talk series. In this series, we are bringing together some of the world's most prominent educators, both practitioners and visionaries that are working on creating new models of education for, let's say, positive vision of the future of the world, what we call thrivable future, flourishing future. And we, of course, want to discuss not just small incremental changes in the existing system. We want to discuss what could be those most important paradigm shifts that need to occur in education to bring the future into reality. And my name is Pavel Luksha. I am the co-founder of Global Education Futures, and we have been established as a group in 2015. Our main work is about researching the future of education and also prototyping it. So we call ourselves Think and Do Tank. And Jeff series is actually talk series is a place where we try to connect with broader audience of different groups that are doing the same stuff around the world. So welcome, and I want to pass the word to my colleague Alexander.
Thank you so much, Pavel. Welcome, Lene Rachel, who is already here on the screen with us. I will say a few things about this particular session here. It's very exciting for me to be here together with the two of you and for us to be able to get to know you, Lene, and your work in this area. So my name is Alexander Laszlo, and I am one of the co-founders of Global Education Futures. And I'm very excited about this talk that we're going to have today, because we're going to be able to hear a little bit from Lene Rachel Andersen about the experience that she has in living this process of what she's going to share with us about what this Bildung is. But let me tell you a little bit before we get into the topic about who we have with us here. So Lene, I'm always doing my best I can with the pronunciation here. Lene Rachel Andersen is a futurist and economist and an author and a keynote speaker. She is the president of Nordic Bildung. So again, the ability to focus on this as a model for education, something that has been brought in, not as a new invention, but as something that is a remembering of how we can really create learning paths in ways that not only bring forward lifelong learning, but life-wide learning. So as a co-founder of the Global Bildung Network and a full member of the Club of Rome, she has done a lot of work in this area. She has, for example, been the primary author of this book. You see, the Nordic Secret here, and it's quite a serious book, and it presents this model, but also in a way that brings it alive. So now we have the opportunity, I think, to learn from you, Lene Rachel, a little bit why, first of all, why this was important to you, what it means to you, and how this has implications for the future of education, both formal and informal. So without any further ado, over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Laszlo and or Alexander and Pavel for inviting me and for letting me talk about what is so dear to me, namely Bildung and the Nordic aspect of it. And I don't know where to start, but I'll try and remember everything. So the Nordic part is that I'm in Denmark. I'm Danish. I grew up here. And whenever I've traveled the globe, and also when I've spoken to people visiting Denmark, or now on Zoom, where we all spend so much time because of the COVID, not least, suddenly everybody was connected in a very unusual way. There is a huge interest in the Nordic countries because they're very well organized, they're very prosperous. We're usually among the happiest people on the globe. Interestingly enough, so I'm from the Nordics. Pavel is in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands, and I know, Alexander, that you have your roots in Switzerland. The other happiest peoples on the globe are usually the Dutch and the Swiss. The interesting thing is that there's a lot of Germany in between those three regions, but the Germans are not as happy as we are. So there must be something we're doing right. And what is fascinating me is, are we doing the same thing right, or are we doing something differently right? Either answer would be equally interesting, I think. But what I found out when I wrote The Nordic Secret, and Thomas Björkman was the editor of the book. So I spent 2 years researching and writing The Nordic Secret. And that was in order to find out, so what is behind this Nordic success? And is there something that others can learn from? Is this something that just happened in the Nordics? Is it like in the water or the climate or something? Then nobody can learn from it. But if it's something that we did right, then maybe others can learn from it. And that is my conclusion. And then what is the secret? The secret is this Bildung thing, and it's a different kind of approach to education, and a different way of thinking of education, and what is the meaning of life, really. So so we did that really well in the Nordics, and it started out as a Danish invention. I should also say that when I think about the Nordic countries, or mention the Nordic countries, it's Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And this Bildung thing is a German invention that was popularized in Denmark. So just briefly, what is the Bildung part in Nordic Bildung? It is looking at education not so much as a transfer of knowledge, but really of unfolding everything that is within the individual learner, the individual child or adult. And the way that I describe Bildung now, well, there is an English word for it. Bildung is a German word. Maybe I should start there. The word Bild means image, and in the very pietistic religious Europe in the 15 and 1600s, the Bild was the image of Christ or God. But then during the Enlightenment and the 1700s, it became a secular image, so the image of what you can unfold and what you can become. And among the German philosophers who wrote about this unfolding of the individual and this growing emotional development of the individual was Herder and Schiller and Fichte and Wilhelm von Humboldt and Hegel. I'm not going to get into the details with those guys. It's not going to be a lecture about German philosophy. But the Bildung concept is really about, yes, I do have a kinder side, and I'm not going to torment everybody who's watching with German philosophy in very much detail. So Bildung is really the emotional development, but it's also the socializing, the formation of the character in the context that you're in. And this is very fluffy, and it's really hard as an educator or as anybody engaged in planning education to talk about formation or socializing people or emotional development, because on the one hand, it would be a disaster if we started measuring it and had certain goals for empathy, for instance, or social integration, or creativity, all these sort of fluffy sides of what it means to be human. On the other hand, if we just keep saying you need to evolve and you need to be socialized and function socially and grasp the culture that you're in, it's almost impossible to say or figure out, are we doing it or are we not doing it? So we have to somehow find that place in the middle where, as educators and planners of education, and as learners and parents, to have an idea of what is Bildung, what is good education, what can we expect from personal development throughout life, and what can we expect from ourselves and others with regards to, for instance, how do we relate to other people, to commitment? It can be to friends, but it can also be to partners and family and workplaces and so forth, which has a lot to do with social norms, but it also has a lot to do with your personal emotional development and moral development. And as I said, I mean, if we try to measure this somehow and say, so you got a 7.8 on friendship and you get a 9.2 on care and empathy, I mean, first of all, we would get people to start performing emotions and behavior without actually having the emotions. They would imitate the outer performance of those emotions rather than perhaps developing them. But it would also be a sort of a tyranny if you had to live up to certain emotional goals in your educational system or in your workplace, for instance. So on the one hand, this is fluffy and must remain fluffy. On the other hand, we need to be able to talk about it so that we know if this is something that we're actually promoting. And so the way that I talk about Bildung now, in order to make it a little bit more concrete, is to say that it's two different kinds of knowledge. And the one kind of knowledge is the knowledge that is easy to transfer, or relatively easy to transfer from person to person. And the other one is the kind of knowledge that you cannot transfer from person to person, or it's extremely hard to transfer from person to person. And the transferable knowledge is the horizontal knowledge. It's a horizontal transfer either from teacher to class, or from parents to children, or from friends to friends, or whatever. But it's eye to eye, so to speak, and you can expand your horizon in all kinds of directions. So it's a horizontal transfer of knowledge. And we can test this. We can actually test, and we can see if people, can reproduce the math or the science that we've tried to teach people. It can also be practical skills like baking a bread or fixing a bicycle or something like that. And you can tell if they can bicycle. You can also tell if they can speak a foreign language if you've taught them the foreign language. So this is relatively easy to figure out, did the transfer go well? The other kind of knowledge is what comes from life experience. And that can be learning either the easy or the hard way. When you're 5 years old, how do I play with the other kids in kindergarten so that they also want to play with me tomorrow? If I cheat in games, if I beat them up, they're probably not going to play with me. If I'm kind, if I play by the rules, they're going to play with me. So we're socialized in that way. When we get older, many of us fall in love, and maybe that goes well. Maybe somebody breaks up with us and we're heartbroken, and then we try to tell somebody how that feels. And if they haven't been through the same experience, we can put as many words on it as we want, and they're not going to have any idea about what we're talking about. But if they've been through the same thing, you just have to start the first sentence and they're going like, I know what you're going through. So there's a resonance. So you cannot transfer the experience, you cannot transfer this kind of knowledge, but you can share it when somebody has had a similar experience. And there is particularly one way where we can, to some extent, transfer this kind of life experience knowledge, and that's through literature. If it's well written, and if you are used to reading and comfortable about reading, and you actually make it's a very complex cognitive process to actually take the little black signs on the paper, transfer them to words into your mind, perhaps even hearing it as a voice that is narrating what you're reading, and then creating the images of where the story is taking place. And then your mirror neurons are going to produce emotions that mirror what the characters are going through in the text. And here we can actually go through some of the emotions that the character is going through, and have some of that non-transferable kind of knowledge happening inside us and growing inside us, even though we're not, I don't know, a prison guard in a concentration camp, or a poor single mother in, I don't know, the favelas in Brazil or something like that. There are all these different places that you're never going to go, and destinies that you're never going to have, but you can experience them through literature. To some extent, you can have it if you listen to a story, to an even smaller extent if you, listening to stories is, I guess, almost as good, but there's more of an active process in actually reading. But watching movies, television, and so forth, not only do somebody, produce the pictures for us, they also usually add sound effects and music to it. So they tell us what kind of feelings we should have when we experience this. Whereas if you're reading or listening to a story, you have to produce that yourself in your own mind. So it's more of an active process, which is another reason why it's so important that you read to kids, because they need to get into the habit of creating their own images in their mind. And if we just force feed them with pictures all day, or actually we don't have to force feed them, they just go running for the iPad. If we just hand them the iPad and they can watch all these images, we're actually blocking part of their cognitive development, because they're not going to start producing images of their own. So this is the best way, or perhaps only way, that we can have a transfer of this non-transferable kind of knowledge. And because the other one is horizontal, and this is about your emotional depth, we can talk about it as the vertical kind of knowledge. So it's how deep your roots are into the cultural fabric. It's about the depth of your emotions, but it's also about your upbringing. There's something about the adults around you telling to live up to their expectations. So there's this vertical development as well. And so the struggle with this, the combination of this, the transferable knowledge, the vertical knowledge, the non-transferable knowledge, and the stuff that you can share with others, discuss with others, and discuss it in different ways, is Bildung. And this allows us to, as educators, be aware about, so am I transferring the right kind of transferable kind of knowledge? I mean, do they get the math they're supposed to get? When I have the whole class there, is there a good spirit in the class? Are they behaving in the, I wouldn't say right way, but in a healthy way, in a good way? Can I, whenever there's a conflict in the classroom, grasp the situation and turn that into a learning experience? How do we handle the anger, the frustration, the sadness, all the sort of ugly emotions, and how do we handle all the good emotions and allow everybody to experience them and learn from them also? So, so as a teacher, as a pedagogue, you're really working in a very complex way. And of course, the more kids or students, adults, whatever you have in your classroom, the more complex it is. And I used to work as a substitute teacher for 3 years while I was studying, and I was also a Girl Scout leader. So, I mean, I've been on the sort of the side of the classroom, or the room where you have the responsibility for everybody thriving for 45 minutes at a time, or 2 hours at a time. And so I know how hard that is. And then you also have to transfer the knowledge that they pay you to transfer. So so that is the Bildung part. And this Bildung concept, I mean, when we go back to Herder and Schiller, they connected to, so now we're in the 1760s and 1770s and 1790s, actually. So when they talked about Bildung, and I'm getting to the historical background for the Nordic Bildung and this whole thing today, where we do need Bildung more than ever, I think. So when they talked about Bildung, they were actually exploring in the sort of inspired by Rousseau's Emile, and how he described the emotional development of this young boy from he was born until he's, I think, 24. Later, we have the Swiss pedagogue Pestalozzi, who is also interested in the emotional development. And then we have Piaget in the early 20th century. And the interesting thing, when you read Rousseau, and he wrote Emile in 1762, and you read Piaget, and you hang around kids today, is that it's the same emotional development. It's been 250 years, and it's the exact same emotional development. Then when we get into adulthood, things look differently, and it becomes more cultural dependent. But overall, I would say what Schiller and Herder noticed in the 1770s and 90s still counts today, particularly what Friedrich Schiller said with regard to Bildung. And so what did he say? Well, he said that there are 3 different kinds of people, and he was talking about adults. He was not talking about children. So he said that there's the first kind of adult is the person who is in the throes of his emotions. So he is not free, because the emotions is sort of running the personality, the person. The second kind of person is not free either, because he's controlled by the expectations of others, and he called that the rational person. So you could say he was governed by the rationale of society. And the reason, so none of these 2 people are free. But you can then, when you're the rational person, you can reconnect with your emotions, and you can become the free person who has both integrated the norms of society, the moral values, and made them your own. And you can feel your emotions again. And when you can do that, you have this double thing going on inside you all the time, because you can now doubt what is the right thing to do. Do I follow my emotions, my desires, what feels right? Or do I follow what everybody else says that I need to do? And what if there's a conflict? So now I have to be able to make up my own mind. And that is what he calls the free person. And he writes this in a book about the aesthetic education of man, Mensch. And he says that, okay, so how do we transcend our emotions and become the rational person? We do that through calming aesthetics, through beauty. So that is where the music, the literature, architecture, beauty can sort of calm our emotions, and we can become aligned with the expectations and values in society. Another way of saying this is also that we become team players. I mean, this is when other people can start trusting us, because that's when you can count on people. So now we become a team player with, that's a modern word, he didn't use the word team player. So now we become a rational person, and we play by the rules of others, and we're not free. So how do we transcend that? That's where we need aesthetics again, but this time it has to be invigorating aesthetics, something that wakes us up and shakes us up. And so we can feel our emotions again. And once we can feel them again, we can become the free person. And apart from this being really interesting and in many ways matching modern developmental psychology in adults, the way that it's been described by, among others, Robert Keegan. I'm increasingly having some doubts about some of what Keegan writes, but there are other adult developmental psychology that says a lot of the same. They have more details, and one of the things, and more phases. And what I like about Schiller is that he has these three big phases in life. I also like the fact that he calls them drives and not stages or phases. So it's more like, what is driving you? What is motivating you? And of course, if you're motivated by your emotions only, you may not be the most accountable person in your neighborhood. If you're motivated by everybody else's expectations, you're not going to be free. And if you're motivated by the inner doubt, freedom, playfulness in your own personal character, then you can actually be a free and autonomous person. And the interesting thing about this is that Schiller wrote this in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And the reason why he wrote it was because he was wondering, why could the French not handle political freedom? Why did they turn their, new political freedom into a bloodbath? And he said, well, the people in the throes of their emotions cannot handle political freedom, because they're just, in the throes of their emotions. And once they decapitate one person and have the guillotine running, they'll just decapitate more people. Bad idea. And the rational people, they're going to follow these people, so they can't be trusted either. The only people who have the moral backbone to feel that we need political freedom, but we can't have a bloody revolution, we need to figure out how to do this in a different way, are the free people. And so he's the only thinker that I know of who has connected the political stability, political freedom, what we know as democracy today, with this Bildung and personal development. And I think that's a really deep insight. And when we look around the world and see where we have the biggest conflicts, where we have the biggest threats against democracy, but also authoritarian rule, where people want everybody else, or the leadership wants everybody else to conform to one set of behavior, I think this is really crucial. So that is Bildung, and Bildung, according to Schiller, is both the process and the result. And so now we can bring this together with the vertical and the horizontal transfer of knowledge, because if you're going to be a free person in your own society, or whenever you're traveling somewhere else, you have to have a lot of that transferable kind of knowledge, because otherwise you're simply not going to grasp what's going on around you. But you also have to have that vertical emotional development that allows you to handle yourself, and that allows you to not freak out when you encounter something that you don't like, or still be able to, you need to be able to have a polite tone of voice and have a civil conversation, even with people that you think are complete, can I say assholes in this? No, I did. So we have to be able to carry ourselves well, and so that is part of the socializing, that is part of the Bildung process. And so the Nordic Bildung, very short version of that, is that bloody as the French. And so this pastor wrote about the peasants in Denmark, they need this Bildung. It's not just for the bourgeoisie, because the sons of the bourgeoisie got all kinds of education and they read Schiller and Fichte and Goethe and all these German guys. But the Danish peasants did not read the German philosophers. And so we had a very good early public education in Denmark for everybody, 7 years mandatory for all kids. By 1814, the legislation was there. 1840, we had the schools and the teachers for it. But there was nothing for young adults who did not go to the tiny minority that didn't go into a high school afterwards or a college. And so this pastor, Grundtvig was his name, came up with the idea of a folk college. And that was for the young farm hands. And it was also at a time when the borders of Denmark was settled during a couple of wars. And so there was a huge wave of nationalism. And it was really important that not only the bourgeoisie, but also the rural population started to understand what is Denmark, because as long as they were just poor peasants and didn't know anything about the world and were not technically citizens, it didn't matter so much if they knew what the country was, but there was an increasing need for them to know that. So the bourgeoisie was also interested in a better educated rural population. So there was support for a better education for them. Long story short, 1851, there's a teacher who realizes, how do you actually make a folk college for the peasants? His name is Christian Kold, came up with 3 brilliant ideas. The one was that we can't bring these farm hands into a school that intimidates them. They have to be able to feel at home and comfortable and not intimidated. So we bought an old farmhouse, moved in with 25 of them, and they were in the age from 18 to 25. Maybe they were a little bit more, 30, I don't know. And so they just lived on the farm together. They worked on the field. They sang a lot of new songs. That was the evening entertainment back in those good old days. And they ate teacher. He realized that whenever he taught the kids what he was supposed to teach them, they didn't pay attention. But when he told them stories, they were listening. And so he started by telling these young farmhands stories. And when he had their attention, he asked them questions, which was the third thing that was really brilliant. And not a lot of people asked young farmhands anything 150 years ago. So this was new to them. And he also let them ask him questions. And then they had a conversation going, and they would be interested in the answers if they asked a question. So that was his pedagogical trick to getting them engaged in everything that he wanted to teach them. And they studied history. They eventually read a lot of books. They discussed them. They learned about politics. They learned about macroeconomics. They learned about the latest agricultural techniques, which was very popular. They learned to make better cheese and better beer. They also learned how to treat their farm animals better according to the latest science. And then they learned, the latest science and what was going on in the world, which to a Danish farmhand 150 years ago was rather unusual, because most of them would just have gone to school until they were 14, and then they would have worked for the rest of their life, and that was it. Now there was this option of moving into actually a boarding school together with other young folks their own age, live and learn together for 3 to 5 months, and then come back to their local community with a sense of confidence, knowing who they are, what they stand for, what is important to them, a firm handshake, and the ability to look other people straight in the eyes and maybe negotiate with some of the big farmers about what to do on my land and what not to do on my land, stuff like that. So they became a driver for development in the Danish rural communities. And from the 1860s and onwards, we got a lot of, first it was cooperative grocery stores organized by the workers, and another pastor, by the way. But eventually it became the farmers who started dairy farms, slaughterhouses, egg hatcheries, and cooperative freezers. So, I mean, having a cooling place was eventually the big new thing. So this transformed not just the mind of a lot of young people, it also transformed the economy of Denmark. And then we became one of the most prosperous and happy countries in the world. The Norwegians copied the folk high schools in the 1860s. The Swedes, 1863 was the first one. The first one in Sweden was 1868, and then in Finland, I think from the 1880s. And around 1900, 130 of these schools had started in Denmark. 100 of them had survived. And when I looked at the number of people in Denmark, the annual cohort, the number of schools, how many students they probably had at each school, it would have been somewhere between 8 and 15% of the annual, probably 8% to 10% of the annual cohort, but definitely 15% of the rural population who went to one of these schools. Eventually, also girls could go to a folk high school for a folk college for girls. And at the same time, particularly Southern Europe was, as far as I know, to a large extent illiterate. So here you have a huge difference, not just in literacy, but also in thinking, critical thinking, knowing about the world, and actually developing, unfolding that which is inside you. And in the Nordics, this is not actually called Nordic Bildung. It is called popular enlightenment, folk Bildung, depending on whether you speak Danish, Norwegian, or Swedish. And now I just translated it into English anyway. But Nordic Bildung was the name that we gave to our Think and Do tank here in Copenhagen when we, based on the Nordic Secret that I wrote, decided that we needed to raise awareness around the globe about this tradition of rethinking education. The fact that this happened in one of the poorest countries in Europe in the 1840s and 50s into the 1860s, in a very low-tech society. So with the technologies that we have out there right now, and with all the global inequality, here is actually something that people could self-organize in rural communities with today's resources in a way that they couldn't do it in Denmark 150, 160 years ago. But the poverty is still out there, the illiteracy is still out there. So we could do a lot more, a lot differently. I've been to Uganda one time and seen some of the, or heard about the education there. And I mean, there's so much low-hanging fruit with regards to improving education globally, particularly if we think it in a completely different way. And this whole Bildung thing, the folk high schools, the pedagogy around this, of course, has shaped the Danish public schools as well, and the private schools that we have in primary and secondary education, and also the universities. And it has, at least until about 10 years ago, been a consensus in Denmark that, of course, all education is free for all, including tertiary education. And I have to say we were doing pretty well until the PISA tests started messing everything up, which is tragic. So we started looking at how do we score on the PISA test, and now we have all these tests in school. That was actually a fourth element of Kristen Kohl's school, was that there will be no diploma. There will be no test. You cannot take an exam at a folk high school. And we still have around 70 folk high schools in Denmark. I think there are 100 of them in Sweden or more. Probably 70 in Norway as well, and some in Finland. In Denmark and Norway, you still cannot get a diploma from a folk high school. In Sweden, you can do your ordinary high school, or at least some of the subjects in a folk high school. So you can get a diploma, and it changes the dynamics of the education, because suddenly the goal is not just learning and being together and exploring what is meaningful to you. It becomes, how do I get the better grades? So so the whole approach to education, where you're not testing kids. I went to school in the 70s and never met a test until the 7th grade. We did get some kinds of grades or statements from the 4th grade and onwards, so at least you had an idea of how you were doing. But it was not numbers, and it was not so that you could calculate an average or anything like that. And there was definitely no, I mean, you have to be extremely poor to sit over and do one repeat a class, and it will usually be because of the emotional part, not because of your academic results. So if you're immature compared to your peers, you may, take the third or fourth grade or first grade one more time. But that would be the only reason. It would not be because of poor math or Danish or something like that. So, so the approach to education is, as I increasingly realize, the more that I talk to people around the globe about education and Bildung, it is really unique in Denmark and the rest of the Nordic countries, or at least was until 10 years ago. So that is, so that is Bildung. That is the Nordic part of it. And Nordic Bildung is a think tank in Copenhagen where we try to tell more people about this, and also figure out, so what should we learn and know today so that we can thrive in today's global environment, and also facing artificial intelligence, climate change, all kinds of challenges, let's call them that. And how do we make sure that that we can have not authoritarian political rule as the default, but human development and flourishing as the default, and thereby also political freedom and democracy. So so that is really the project here at Nordic Bildung.
Lene, thank you so much for that. And now we can enter a little bit perhaps into some conversational aspects around this. Pavel and I will share with you some reflections and some things that have come up and some further ways of looking at this in ways that we hope will help others also, through helping ourselves, learn more about this. I think perhaps we can think about this in a couple of ways. One is further information, knowledge, understanding about Nordic Bildung, about folk schools, folk high schools, and so on. Just a little more clarification. We have some questions around that. Then there are questions also about implications for the future of education. Global Education Futures, of course, is exactly about global education futures. And so we're looking into then, so what are the implications for this? How could this be, if you had your magic wand and, you were to bring this into the future in some ways, how would Bildung inform education globally, and how should it do so? And of course, then there are the aspects which I think are very important as well to explore with you, is what this means to you personally, and how this lives in you, and why this for you experientially, the stories of you, your story around this in that sense also. But let me start with a quick. Actually, I don't know how quick this is, but if you could help us all understand a little bit about the similarities and the difference between Bildung and, let's say, things like Reggio Emilia and Waldorf and Montessori, and so these are things. So are they? How compatible are they? How different? How much can they be combined, or how distinguished? And what ways can we distinguish them from those kind of alternative educational systems in the sense of the mainstream education, PISA kind of things, and also how this relates to the differentiation between pedagogy and what Malcolm Knowles wrote about as andragogy, and this is more one or the other, or is there a pandragogy component? Is there a lifelong component to the life-wide learning as well?
There was a lot of questions. I forgot half of them, but you can help me. Something that I miss here. So, I mean, Montessori and Rudolf Steiner and these sort of very specific schools, I bet that they have a lot of this Bildung stuff built into them. I do not know them specifically. You see, I do not come with a background in pedagogy, so I've not studied them. I only sort of heard about them and know people who've gone to some of these schools, or people who send their kids there. I mean, they have definitely seen something and are doing something that is fundamentally different from many of the other schools. And what I think is interesting about many of our school systems, I mean, there's also somebody like what's his name from the US. I was just about to say it, slipped my mind. 150 years ago, 100 years ago. The big pedagogue. It'll be there in a second. So Dewey. I mean, we have all these people who are involved in exploring how do kids learn? How can we do this better? And for some reason, they're not the ones that politicians listen to when they decide what our school systems are supposed to be like. So first of all, that's very strange, but we also see it in healthcare. Nobody listens to the nurses and the doctors, and we have it now in the military in Denmark. Nobody listens to the military. It's all the politicians deciding what our defense is supposed to be like, and now I shouldn't say this if the Russians are listening, but now it's falling apart. So, so we have all these people that we've actually educated to know something about something, and then we have politicians who decide how that thing is going to be run. And now I'll go back to education, because that's where things get a little weird. I mean, that nobody listens to the school teachers, nobody listens to the pedagogues, and then they decide what the not the curriculum, but what the format should be and how many kids should be in each class, and so forth. So we actually have people who have dedicated time and effort to figuring out how do kids learn, and how do young adults learn, and how do adults learn, and what happens when you learn in one way, and what happens when you learn in another way, or teach in one way and teach in another way. And we're not using that knowledge for very much, or at least not as much as we could use it for. And then you have these people who have an idea about, I want to make a school this way. And they have some level of success with that. And then people say, this public school or the standard school does not work for me and my kid. Let's send them there. Or they have an ideological or religious reason for sending them there. And so they go there. And I think it's really fruitful that we have these different clusters or ways of experimenting with what could education be like. And that was actually one of Grundtvig's main thoughts, was that the government should actually completely stay out of education, because once you have the government defining education, you're not a free people anymore, which I find is a really interesting thought. On the other hand, as a citizen, I really prefer to feel confident about all kids getting education that has a certain standard, and that there is science and math and unpopular views, other religions than that religion of the parents, and so forth, that all kids learn about. Because otherwise, we can't be sure that everybody can actually still have a meaningful conversation within the same country. So, so there's a balance there between having private schools and special pedagogies that define one's school or chain of schools, and then the public school system that I think should have a lot more pedagogical freedom and handing a lot more responsibility over to the teachers, because they are the ones who know how to teach kids. Technically, I don't, because that is not my professional background. But I tried it, and what I also realized, one of the reasons why I did not become a teacher actually was because I really enjoyed being with the kids. I really enjoyed teaching. Actually, I loved it, but I hated the teacher's lounge. I mean, you have like 50 adults who have a rather long and good education, and the only people who see their work are 8-year-olds or 16-year-olds, and there is no sort of career opportunity. I mean, the school systems are structured differently. In the US, you teach like 3rd grade all the time and all topics. In Denmark, you teach maybe a topic through different grades. But still, it's kids who see your work. You have to convince the parents that you're doing the right thing. Education, I mean, the classes can be organized now. Teachers are teaching and sort of have groups now, where so they do have other adults in the classroom, and they do have a different kind of collaboration. But when you're 45 and you know what you're doing, there's not a lot of opportunity for saying, okay, unless I want to be a headmaster of a school, what would be the next thing that I can do? And then you can add a college degree to that, or write a PhD or something like that. But it's not gonna do anything for your career. You're just going to be more frustrated, because you're still going to go back to the 2nd grade on Monday morning with your new knowledge about, I don't know, quantum physics or Soren Kierkegaard or something like that. So, or Pestalozzi. So the way that we allow teachers to develop, evolve, and have their Bildung process as part of something that could enrich the education is just ridiculous. So you talked about the magic wand, and I would say if I were to use the evil magic wand and design a school system that would screw the education up completely, I would take 30 kids of the same age, irrespectively of their interests, their intelligence, their talents, or anything, put them into one room. And the only common denominator would be that they were born within the same time span of 365 days. Then I would ask them to sit down for 45 minutes and not move, and pay 100% attention to one adult in the room who would try to reach all of them with the same message, and then ask the same task of all of them. And if they felt like getting up or playing or peeing or anything like that, I would tell them to wait until there was a bell. And I would make sure that the content had absolutely no relevance to their life outside of this room. And I would also grade their results, and I would sometimes yell at them or punish them if they had a really poor result, because I would think that would really improve their results if I intimidated them with my voice and my physical size, because I would be bigger than them. So that would be the evil magic wand. If I had the good one, I would say we need to be better at combining, because there is a quality to bringing kids together that are different and that have the same age and that have and that's where the emotional development and maturity comes into the picture, that have a sort of a sense of peer and being of the same age and experiencing pop culture, puberty, all that stuff at pretty much the same time, because that's part of your becoming a whole adult. But we also need to provide all children with what they find interesting and meaningful and at the right time. And I'm going to bring in Vygotsky and the zone of proximal learning, because the zone of proximal learning is, of course, very different, extremely different throughout life. But the interesting thing is that we thrive at the zone of proximal learning. And we met at a learning planet, and the whole planet is actually a learning place. I mean, from the smallest fungus to the biggest genius and even to AI now, we're all learning. That is how we thrive. So learning actually is one of the most fun and meaningful activities we can have, and somehow we managed to create a school system that kills it in almost all of the children. One of the things that I find most frustrating is that when I talk about this Bildung and education in Denmark right now, but also in other places, but of course, where I participate in the public debate is more here in Denmark than elsewhere. If I just, kind of hint at maybe a need for other adults to understand more about the world as the world is progressing, or at least developing at an extremely fast pace, a lot of people get offended. And I don't think they get offended because I suggest that they should have new knowledge, because we all must, but because going to school has been such a bad experience that, along with the suggestion that there is something you do not know yet that would be useful for you to know, and would be useful for all of us if we all knew it as citizens in the 21st century, rather than seeing that as, but of course, yes, what is it that we don't know yet? The reaction is, yeah, but who are you to tell me that I'm stupid, or that I mean, who are you to tell me that you know more than I do? I think that comes from poor experiences in school. And I think it comes from education being associated with being there with a feeling that you're dumb, or that you're wrong, or that it's just meaningless. And it's just people who know stuff who force me to do things that I don't like. And I mean, how sad is that we created a system where kids actually have their curiosity ruined, and their sense of belonging, their life being meaningful. Right now we have a mental health crisis in the West with a lot of anxiety and depression. And that has coincided with social media, and I think that plays a huge role. But I also think it plays a role that we've actually more or less eliminated all the subjects in school that are about meaning making. Literature, art, poetry, history, psychology, philosophy, history of ideas, all the storytelling, all the the religion, all the human existential and aesthetic experiences throughout history, and what brought us here, and the ability to see yourself as part of a community, part of a historical chain of being, circles of life, a civilization, a community, and we're taking that out of. Every time we want to optimize the school system, that is what we cut down on. So we're just telling young people that, you're part of the economy. You must optimize your work skills, and here's all the STEM topics that you need to know and be better at, instead of saying, what are your talents? What is it that you need to unfold? Oh, so you want to play the violin? Let's teach you more music. You also have to be able to do the math. You can't go out, can't leave school without understanding it, because people are gonna, screw you when you don't know how to do basic calculation, and you need to pay taxes and understand if you're doing the right thing. So, there are things that we do need to teach everybody, but there's also a much more um, need for that which each individual finds meaningful. And unless we have this brought, both I've created a model called the Bildung Rose, and anybody can Google Bildung and Rose, and it will appear on the internet. Such is the internet. So it's a description of society through 7 domains, and we need to learn all of them. One domain is production, so we all need to have skills to actually provide for ourselves in the economy. Another one is technology, and that is, the exponential development and complexity in technology is tearing society apart, and we need to understand it. And so we need to understand technology, but we also need to be safe around. We all grew up with electricity and knowing that you don't put a metal thing into the socket in the wall. And so there's basic knowledge about these technologies that we all need to have. Aesthetics, beauty is a crucial part of human life and what it means to be human. So we need to teach and explore that in school. Political science, the power structures of our society, we need to understand that. We also need to understand science, not so much the results, but we need to understand that too. But the process, how is scientific knowledge produced? Because that also explains why scientists disagree, and why there is, in some cases, yes, there are the answer, and we haven't been able to prove it wrong for, 300 years, 200 years. So we kind of rely on that. It's a tiny chance it might be off. But there are facts out there. And we reach those in a different way than other kinds of knowledge. And then there are narratives that hold our society together, and where our moral values are embedded. And that's the storytelling. It's political ideology. It's also history lessons. There's a huge fight in the US right now over history, because everybody is a moral person, and they have different moral values. And so they want to tell a different version of history to match their moral values, which means that half the population learns one version of US history, and another half of the population, I don't know what the numbers are, but another part of the population learns a different version of US history, instead of learning both. So so we need to be able to teach this as history in the scientific sense, but also as narrative. And then there's ethics, which is sort of the principles behind our moral values. And the way that I distinguish between moral values and ethics is that moral values tell us how to behave in familiar situations. Somebody has been in the same situation before us, and we have developed norms for it. Ethics is what we can look into when we're in an unfamiliar situation. And right now we're in very unfamiliar situations, a lot of them actually. And so we need to find out what are our ethics, because the moral values are not enough. They can't grasp what we're dealing with. And so we need to have principles behind our actions in a completely different way, and that's very abstract. But a good school system, a Bildung school system, would actually teach all of this and allow the kids and the adults to explore all these different parts of society and human life. And you could also take this sort of, I have the political power, the power structure in the middle, and then I have these other domains around it. You could sort of lay it down and say, these are the horizons in that you can expand your knowledge with regards to production, technology, aesthetics, science, narratives, and ethics. And you can study this, and you can always expand your horizon and learn more about all of them. And the more that we understand in all of these different domains, the more we can also cross-pollinate and learn from one domain and use in the other one. If we look at, for instance, science and aesthetics, they are two different, very different kinds of knowledge production. The scientific knowledge production is about the objective reality, where we try to get as close as we can to something that we can't prove wrong. And so we all have to agree on it. Gravity, for instance. I mean, it's there. Jump out the window and no, don't. But drop something heavy on your foot, and it'll, no matter who drops it, it'll fall at the same acceleration. The arts, on the other hand, is extremely subjective. It's individual. It's everything that is meaningful to that one particular artist in that one particular way that only that artist can express it. So it's the opposite, but it's a different kind of knowledge. It's symbol production. Not simple, but symbol. And so it produces new symbols and new ways of dealing with the reality that we're in. And when everything is developing so fast as it is right now, we need both science and the arts to explain what on earth is going on and how can we grasp this. And if kids stop singing when they're 7 years old and the wheels on the bus or something like that, and don't get a feel for what is the musical heritage in my tradition, what are the deep roots into the musical fabric of the civilization that I'm in, there are things that they just cannot hear in the music that is out there because they can't, their musical vocabulary is too simplistic or crude. So we need to teach music, and we need to teach it in meaningful ways. And every child ought to learn to play an instrument, or at least sing in a choir, because it's also about that's the transcendence into, I mean, from being all in your emotions to becoming a team player. To align your emotions with a choir or a band or a musical tradition. That goes 300,000 years back to the first human beings. I mean, keeping a rhythm together and singing together around the campfire, or like the New Zealandish haka for war, whatever the reason is, or just to intimidate the other tribe to avoid the war. But that coordination and being part of a group is something that is deeply human and part of our deep emotional structure and meaning making. And we're not giving kids that. We're not giving teenagers that. And so, of course, they go looking for it on YouTube or TikTok or somewhere, and they listen to a lot of music. They have their own. Each generation has their own music. But it's not a communal production of music. It's not necessarily being aligned with or coming into the moral norms and the expectations of others, and definitely not necessarily the democratic, free, open society, but maybe some kind of toxic subculture, or maybe just a subculture that is not good for them. So as school systems, as educators, we need to be much better at this. I would also say, with regards to the magic wand, and that's the what is the knowledge that everybody needs to have, because I think there is some kind of, I don't think we can define one curriculum that everybody needs to have or grasp, but we can't rely on the kids just have to learn how to learn, and then there's the internet and they can go on Wikipedia and find everything they need. because there's so much misinformation out there. So one of the crucial things for education today is to somehow build up that grid of information structure inside their minds that allows them to evaluate information. And they need to have some kind of knowledge that they can hold it up against and say, does this actually sound reasonable? Does this make any kind of sense? And so it's really, really important that the established school systems teach basic science, basic math, geography, history, the sort of the big picture in a number of fields, so that when young people leave school and they start to get the right to vote, not least, but also when you're, buying your first apartment or house or whatever it is, or make other decisions as part of an adult life, that you can tell information from misinformation or lies and conspiracy theories and all kinds of things that at the emotional level feels great, but just has no connection to reality. So that is one of the huge tasks of schools. And I think one of the things that we have done in Denmark, and I think we stopped doing it, but 20 years ago, there was this whole wave of responsibility for your own learning and the learning to learn. And first of all, the responsibility for your own learning was great for the kids who had parents with an academic degree who could help them, but all the kids from working class or social welfare families, they were just lost because they just, felt, oh, I don't have to learn anything. Great. Or if they wanted to learn anything, they couldn't have their parents help them. So there needs to be a structure, and there needs to be something that serves everybody, no matter what their background is and their parents' background. And then there needs to be the curriculum of some sort, and there needs to be both the collective, and that's also the Bildung part. I mean, you need to learn to be around kids that are not interested in what you're interested in. Yeah, it's a combination.
Lene,
So that would be my magic. Yeah.
there are a few more questions that we wanted to ask, and
Yes.
actually now it's also an opportunity for people that are watching us online to ask questions in the YouTube comment box. So we are going to announce them if any come. There is one actually that I'm going to announce in a moment. But listening to you, one question that I hold immediately is that your discussion sounds like music to my ears, definitely. And I remember in terms of music, how I was impressed in New Zealand by the revival of their indigenous education in their school system that brings actually musical component into learning, and not just bringing that component, but they try to learn everything by integrating it with music. So they have teams of young students learning together and kind of composing songs, composing their own melodies to capture the learnings that I had, for example, in mathematics or in physics. So it kind of gets integrated beautifully with other elements of learning. And even more so, they also spend 2-3 hours each day singing in a choir together. So I was very, very impressed how kind of this becomes almost like a backbone of their education. And let me tell you, I was in New Zealand with some colleagues, including the ones that actually are responsible for PISA testing. And I am aware that Andreas Schleicher, for example, is one of really deep humanists in terms of his own views about the future of education. And he leads the PISA testing initiative at the same time. And I am really curious that actually thinking about the future of Nordic countries, thinking about the future of the world, we are facing very similar challenges in terms that require us to abandon the model that is based on, let's say, this testing that is only focused on cognitive side, and begin exploring a totally new model that is based on relations, that is based on student empowerment. And the question that was there also relates to student empowerment, but I'm going to ask it after this one. Actually, what do you think is the blockage right now, and how can we move systemically into the future, especially since apparently literally the majority of stakeholders understands that this shift needs to happen, but somehow we got stuck in this kind of vortex or black hole from which we cannot depart, which is a wrong, let's say, wrong setting, and everybody recognizes it's wrong. You say teachers recognize it, politicians now recognize it, even business recognizes it. They need different skills. Why are we there? How can we depart? What is that push that is needed right now?
I mean, we're in this weird situation where we have more robots and more computers and more calculating power and more automatization than we've ever had before. And we still keep working, at least in Denmark, 37 hours per week. In some places, 40, 50, 60 hours per week. It's ridiculous. What is it that we're working for? I mean, we have reached a time in human civilization where we can do whatever we want with ourselves on this planet. We could create a meaningful life. The big challenge, as I see it, is that we've created an economic system that needs to keep increasing the money mass in order to pay back the existing debt with interest. And if we don't keep doing that, the whole system will crash. And so we cannot lose our faith or belief in the money that we have and the system that we have. If we could figure out how to change that economic model, we could all work, I don't know, 20 hours in what we call work, daytime job today, maybe 10 hours even. And then we could spend the rest of the time learning and playing and being together with family and friends, learning how to play an instrument, developing our social and emotional capacities, relationships, and so forth. We could reduce inequality tremendously, and we could also become it could be a much more sustainable kind of life, and you could have much more interesting local environments where there was a lot of art, a lot of culture, a lot of music with local roots and local flavor, food for that matter, apropos of flavor. So we could rethink civilization to become something entirely different. But we need to have the idea first, and we need to rethink, so what is success? What is wealth? And if you think that success is having 8 cars and a 2,000 square meter house with a private jet and a helicopter and something like that, we're not going to make it as a species and as a planet. If we think success is to have meaningful and deep relationships, to be able to play the piano and sing in a choir and have a lot of friends and only have to work 20 hours per week, we could actually solve, I would say, almost all the problems that we're facing right now, because all the problems we're facing are problems we created. I'm not going to dismiss capitalism. It has created a lot of really good stuff, including the Zoom that we're on right now. So I'm not against everything in the past, but we're just at a point where we could do things so radically differently, and that's hard because a lot of people have struggled to get maybe the first car, which is an old cheap car, but it's a car, and their neighbor does not have a car, and so now they have status in the neighborhood. And so how do we, and the neighbor who maybe actually does know how to play the violin does not have the same kind of status because he does not have a car. So our moral values, our narratives about what is the good life, are, they're tuned in the, tuned in the wrong melody, and they're tuned in the wrong tune key. So but I mean, it's very easy for me to be here in a Nordic country with so much welfare state, social security. There's a whole safety net that catches me if I do something wrong with my life, and say, oh, just give up all that material striving and start to play the violin. I know that's a very privileged viewpoint, but it's also, I think, the major chance that we have is that we actually aim for a more meaningful life. And education could be set up for that. And what I also think is really crucial is that the way that we think education is a direct result of the industrialized society. So the point was to get workers who did not have access to a lot of information to memorize the facts that they needed for the rest of their adult life, including what are the rules in society, who's the king, and who runs the country, and then to play by the rules. Now we do have access to all kinds of information, which makes it so much more important that you can actually be critical whenever you face new information. But you also do not have to memorize stuff, but you have to have that. And there's an interesting Swedish Bildung thinker who says that Bildung is what is left when you have forgotten what you've learned. So there's this pattern of knowledge that is left when you forgot all the details. But whenever you run into a detail that sounds wrong somehow, you know who to ask or where to go looking to see, is this actually true? And who can I ask? Who would be the right person to ask? I mean, we can take the vaccines, for instance. Who would be the right person to ask about these vaccines? And who would be the wrong person to ask? And if I fear having a vaccine that I do not understand, how can I get the knowledge that is needed to grasp what this is about? And I can only do that if I've had some chemistry and biology in school at a certain level. I cannot explain those vaccines, but I have enough knowledge about biology and chemistry to grasp who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't. And so that is what we should get out of this. So the whole idea of education is based on workers for the industrialized society who will not get more education once they're either 18 or 25, depending on the length of their education. And then they'll die when they're 62 because they'll, they've been working so hard. And anyway, we haven't invented central heating and good health care medicine yet. So people won't live any longer than that. But now we do live longer. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is also think of what is the good life? When you're in your reproductive years, what should that part of your life be like? When you're beyond your reproductive years, what should that part of your life be like? Why not have 2 or 3 different professions over the course of your life if you live until you're 110? Why would you have to be, have your college degree when you're 25 and then do the same thing for 85 years or something like that? I mean, because you can't retire when you're 70 and live until you're 110. At least not, we can't do it. Everybody can't do it. So we have to work until we're at least 100 if we live until we're 110. So we need to figure out what is the economic model for such a long lifespan, and how can we, and this is where the life experience and the vertical knowledge comes into it. How do we make the best use of all that life experience? And maybe it is that if you started out as a nurse when you're 25, you work for 10 or 20 years as a nurse, and then you go into becoming a biology teacher. Or then when you've been a biology teacher for a while, you study business economy, because now you would actually be the perfect leader for a biotech company because you have the life experience, you've worked as a nurse, you know what it's like to, distribute medicine and care with really humans. So, or if you're an executive by the age of 45, will you be doing that for the next 50 years or 30 years? Why not use that leadership knowledge in a classroom, for instance, and teach high school and bring in a different kind of knowledge and experience to that environment? And one of the amazing things about having 2 different academic backgrounds, and I know that from my own life, I studied business economy for 3 years before I studied theology for 4 years. I can use the knowledge from one field to learn about the other field and examine whether that makes sense or could be done in a different kind of way. I also spent some years as a entertainment and comedy writer in Denmark, and so I see that as my craft, my trade. It's not just a talent. It is actually something that you can learn some tricks of the trade, and I can use those tricks of the trade as I write about economy and big history and the other things. So I can combine different kinds of knowledge, and nobody set up an education for economy, theology, comedy writing anywhere. I did apply for the theology studies though by saying that I'd studied the economy for 3 years, and the church always had a lot of money, so it was the right place for me, and they let me in. So
Yeah, so thank you, Lene. The question from the viewers of our conversation is actually related to the stories, and you highlighted throughout the conversation today how stories are actually important. So well, obviously the role of storytelling in learning that you are advocating is very important, maybe one of the most important ones. And the question is what is the right way of telling the stories? What is the storytelling that really helps humans to learn, and how to make storytelling that is, so to say, not just happy talk, as Richard Jordan wrote it, but maybe the one that really creates that learning experience.
I don't know the reference that you have there, but I would say anything that, see, storytelling is not just entertainment, and that was my attitude when I was a substitute teacher. So if the kids behaved, or if there was 10 minutes left of the lesson, I could read a story. But I've come to realize that no, storytelling is actually where things begin. And if I can get the kids' attention at the beginning of the day with a story and have them interested in something, then I've moved something inside the children. And that was what Kristen Cole did with those young farmhands. I'm actually collaborating with the Danish school right now about trying to get more storytelling and more singing into the general the general life of the kids in the school. And the feedback is that the kids and the teachers really love it. And they just need to as I did, reevaluate what is storytelling. Is it just entertainment, or is it actually one of the most fundamental ways of human learning? And it is. That is how knowledge was transferred from generation to generation around the campfire for 300,000 years. And that is how a lot of indigenous peoples around the globe, even today, know about the landscape that they're in. And that is why you can create Netflix and have everybody sitting on the couch at home just licking up all kinds of storytelling that may not actually produce a lot of knowledge, but it's just repetition of the moral values in our society, either because people break the moral norms and they are the villains, or they allow people to keep the moral norms and they're the heroes. So it's very predictable, the kind of stories that they're telling. And so we need to make education as captivating as that. And I think that is what can happen when you have that person-to-person relationship, and when the teacher or the narrator cares about what they're telling. And I think that's the key. If this is important to you, and the kids, the adults around you are important to you, then it's happening. If the people are not important, or what you're telling them is not important, then nothing is going to happen. And so, and particularly if we're going to be online with just being on the screen all the time, I would say triple up on storytelling, and let the kids watch YouTube videos with math. We have to rethink education if we're going to be on the screens. And even without being on the screens, I also think that the learning should actually take place at home, and then the discussion should take place in the classroom, instead of teachers transferring the horizontal kind of knowledge. that is what you should be able to find online. And then you should come to school prepared with your questions and your, did I do this right? Or get the assignment and then struggle with it while you can have the teacher's help in the classroom. So we need to rethink how do we structure education? Because now we have different means, completely different means. We didn't have this 10 years ago. So the needs of society are different. The tools are different. The situation is different. Everything is changing. So we need to rethink this. And I think we could even have more happy children. And
Fantastic.
teachers.
Indeed. And society. And nature. Yes, this is, I think, the part of the path to thrivability, not just sustainability, living within the carrying capacity of our environment, but really the celebration of life and the learning how to human well. I think that's partly what we're talking about here. When Pavel was referencing the Richard Jordan, that's one of the participants here who's online, who made a question to you, and they were also talking specifically about this way in which you were just saying the transfer of knowledge. And they were mentioning that this is really a circular process. And I think that's a very good observation. You addressed that also in the three principles, about how the students are asked the questions, not only asking the questions, but you ask the questions of the learner, right, to get them involved. And that's a different way of engaging, not just, that's part of this circular framing that also Richard was affirming in some of his questions. So now we're coming to the end. We have about 7-8 more minutes, and we will be wrapping up. So just one observation for me, and see how you think about this, because I had a little aha as you were speaking, because of the culture as well. I learned that I believe it's in Swedish, the word for business generally, popularly, is näringsliv. It's nourishment for life. Nourishment for life, which is very different from busyness, right?
Busyness. It's like being busy and more of it.
Just that, exactly. And it's even worse in Spanish. I'm living here in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and in Spanish it's negocio, right? That's business, negocio, and ocio is leisure. Neg means not leisure, so you're not at leisure, negocio, right? So your life is just busyness, doing things, not being at leisure. It's like it becomes the rat race, right? And about learning for life, learning for meaning making. And I think this is where we're talking about restoring our relationships with life, essentially. And the Bildung that you've been talking about, here's my observation. I'm just thinking about Ubuntu from the Zulu and the Xhosa in South Africa, and it's a real cultural framing. It's a little bit along the lines of näringsliv, that's why I mentioned it. But the idea that I am because we are, and there's the corresponding responsibility. We are because I am participating in this bigger us. So if Ubuntu is a bit about the tuning and the sense ability, and Bildung is about the learning and the response ability, and there's the North and the South, and there's an aesthetic there as well in terms of the balance. What do you think about that, and any final reflections as we wrap up?
I think that we can actually go around the globe and find versions of Bildung and Ubuntu everywhere. People, civilizations, languages, cultures may have seen it from a different angle. They may express it differently, but the moral and emotional development, the socializing, being, formation into your community, learning what you need to learn in order to function as an adult, and so that other people can trust your skills. I mean, that is basic human life. And we wouldn't have been here as a species if that had not been what life has, been for 300,000 years, and even before that. But I guess our species, the way that we are, is about 300,000 years old. So yes, Ubuntu and Bildung are cousins or siblings, not exactly twins, but pretty close. And we actually had a Global Bildung Day a couple of years ago, or 2 years ago, where we had Mampela Rampele from South Africa talking about Ubuntu. We also have a Global Bildung Day coming up in 3 weeks, actually, where we're going to look at globalization, nation, and peoplehood in the 21st century. Because how do we deal with this thing called the nation state. There's the necessary part, which is the good. Love of country is a good thing, and a lot of us are connected to a lot of us, and where we have functioning societies and freedom and democracy, the nation state and the language of the nation state allows us to be meaning making in the same language as the legislation, and we can participate in the public discourse, and we can understand what's on the news, and we can catch nuances when the politicians are saying something, and whether they're speaking the truth or they're coming up with stuff, and we can sense that if we share the same language. So we do need the nation states, but they can also be toxic and become a national chauvinism when we use other peoples or minorities as the sort of the other in order to define who we are. And so part of our upbringing in Bildung is, of course, to relate to the family, to the peer group, the local community, the nation state, and we have educational systems that have really focused on the nation state for the past 200 years. But now we need the continent and the globe as well. So we need education for those different group sizes and levels of complexity. And so that's another aspect. And so the meaning making in different groups and also in different languages, I don't think English is the first language of any of us here. So we're among the privileged people who can actually have this conversation. The vast majority, even of Europeans, but the vast majority of the world population can't even understand what we're saying. So we need to deal with that, and that's also the horizontal transfer of knowledge. We need to have actually to be able to talk to one another.
Beautiful. There's one last question I did want to get here from one of our participants. Lori Niren asks, I think, a very good question. I think to end with. Again, we have just a couple of minutes left, so in concision here. She asks, what advice would you give to someone working to create the kind of schools we need for the new age? I refer to a starting point. What would you say?
Take it into the public debate, talk about it wherever you go, and make some experiments during the weekend, or set up, a volunteer organization, join the Scouts. Something like that. I would say there are places in the world where I would not dare do that, because there would be people who would be, really angry if you tried to step outside, very narrow norms and expectations and political, authoritarianism. But if you live in a society where this is an opportunity, a possibility, go ahead and start something. Take an initiative and make it work with 12 kids or adults or 20 in your neighborhood, and find out how you can learn from it. One last thing, the problem with a folk high school, the way that they are historically created, is that you need a farmhouse with a room and kitchen and stuff for 100 people. So it's a hard place to start, and one of the things that we're doing in Nordic Bildung is trying to come up with different ways of organizing this kind of folk Bildung and Bildung, so that you do not have to start with this huge investment and in buildings and venue, but maybe make a city folk high school, or a part-time thing, or something that can do some of the same, have some of the same impact. So we are experimenting, and we're just starting.
Awesome. I'm going to let Pavel say the last word here as we wrap up. But I want to say the secret is out. Part of this is this is available. You can get it and have a look at this, and has a lot of very useful framing as well. So Lene Rachel, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to learning much more in the years to come with you as well. Pavel?
Thank you very much, Lene. Thank you, Alexander, and thank you everyone who watched this. And I feel that we step out of this definitely more informed about how to create education of the future than we started this conversation. And I feel like there's a road ahead is very long, but it's very inspiring. So thank you very much, and looking forward to more interaction. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and come to our next guest talk the next time. We'll be continuing these conversations with all of you. Goodbye then.
Bye.